This is a quick documentary of my work on the Performance and Product Development unit this year. I'm going to be walking you through my creative process, the composition of the music I've created for the summative, and some of the things I learned recording and mixing it. I'll also go into some detail about how I managed the project, and the most notable of the many collaborations that I went through this year. Hopefully it's going to fit into 15 minutes, otherwise my portfolio is going to have to do a bit of heavy lifting. My time in lockdown was spent studying music theory and composition, and I was composing the songs that would make up the Deep Blue EP. This EP had 4 songs, and the songs on it were the ones that I thought would be in my 18 minutes when I arrived here. Many of these initial songs started life as like explorations of a couple music theory concepts, like how to competently use specific scales. I had these songs already mostly written by the start of the year, and the very first thing that I wanted to do was to get feedback for them. I had not shown them to anybody at this point, and I wanted to make sure that my work was at a good enough standard to finally begin the recording process. The first 2 months or so were pretty much me just getting feedback for the Deep Blue EP and acting on it. By this time, I'd recorded very little, and I would continue to make huge revisions to most of these songs throughout the year. While it was going on, my time in the practice rooms every Friday was spent engaging in these performance challenges that we were given at the start of the year.
Joe starts us
It's kind of like musical speed dating, I guess. I only knew a couple people when I started the year, because my first 2 were in Norwich. The songs and groups I worked with for the first couple sessions didn't go anywhere, but things did get better. Plans changed as early as November, as I began working with Ellie on a few things, including what would eventually become Trap Street. This song would go on to be part of my 18-minute summative. I'll get into more detail on Trap Street later. As soon as I'd acted on my feedback and on the pre-production, I began recording bass. Recording bass was something that I was extremely familiar with, but it always takes longer than you'd expect. Nonetheless, I've learned from my past experiences the best way to get bass recorded properly is a bit antithetical to how I normally write. Before going into the studio, I need to codify everything about the bass line by notating it into sheets. I had a few problems with recording songs that came from inexperience. I'd never recorded any vocals myself before, and so while I composed songs in keys that sounded great instrumentally, I did have the issue that my voice simply wasn't suited for every song that I brought to uni with me. It might not sound like a big deal initially because there are things you can do about this, like change the key of the song, adjust the melody a little bit, but it ended up being one of the biggest problems I faced this year. The reason why is because it was compounded by a second problem. I deliberately put off recording vocals initially because I wasn't confident in my ability to perform well enough on the recordings. I wanted to get as much time, and therefore practice, as I possibly could before I needed to record, so I spent several months recording other instruments and collaborating, completely unaware of this problem I was going to have later on. What that led to was much of the time spent recording instruments my song up to that point being wasted. I had to change key to several of my songs, and that meant re-recording every pitched instrument. I did as much of this from home as I could, and I booked out edit suites where possible to record parts. If I'd have used more guitar and not been as reliant on the kind of MIDI synths and strings like Kontakt and Alchemy, it would have been a hell of a lot worse. That is a lesson learned. The biggest offender would have to be my song Liminal Spaces. I wrote a very high-range jumping melody for the chorus, and I'm not convinced that would be a realistic goal for me. That being said, once I'd corrected the keys for the other songs, I decided to keep Liminal Spaces the same, but as an instrumental. Despite being unrealistic as a vocal melody, I did like what I did with the song, and I chose to replace the janky top line with a nicer electric piano sound. It now serves as a slightly longer interlude halfway through my 18 minutes of music. Similarly, the lyrics that I recorded weren't always the same as what I'd initially written. A problem I'd uncovered when practicing singing with my friend Bridget is that I didn't put enough thought into my accent and my enunciation when writing lyrics. So to conclude all that, vocals were among the biggest headaches I had to deal with this year, but that was all down to my inexperience. I finally got round to making the same mistakes that everyone else had already done years ago at this point, and my later vocal recordings ended up being far more efficiently recorded, like this.
And so if why couldn't I?
Simply understanding how to effectively prepare for recording vocals helped a lot as well. So did Flex. That let me settle for a take that was almost perfect, rather than drive myself crazy trying to get a hole in one. So learning from this experience, I've also gained some understanding on how to make lyrics flow better phonetically, and found a few specific sounds that are a bit of a pain for me to get right. My lyric writing has definitely improved. I would cite my work on Gone by Morning as a clear example of that.
No, I see the wonders above, recollections of a long lost dream state. I wish that we had more time on to and it talks to me in my sleep. Stories of a place far beyond the mountains.
Throughout the year, I booked out a lot of studio time to make sure I would get this coursework done to the deadlines. I'd set out a checklist of points to make, and once April came around, I had enough time booked in the edit suites that I was going there literally every day for 3 hours at a time. One problem I ran into with my checklist of points was that I was maybe a bit too flexible. I had no problem adding new songs whenever I got a new idea, and if I'd have figured out which songs I was going to use sooner, I could have saved myself a lot of time and worked a lot more efficiently. As the year progressed, I started to feel like my initial approach to the EP was more and more incorrect. My interests drifted, and I wanted my music to be more accessible. I wanted to make music that people would actively enjoy, rather than they just think is interesting or pretty. Throughout the year, I wrote 4 more songs completely, and several smaller chunks of music. 2 of these, Trap Street and Gone by Morning, have ended up part of my main 6, while the others are still on the back burner, and I will continue to work on those when I've finished this initial EP. I mixed all the tracks myself, after being shown the basics by my tutor Tom. This was a really rapid process for me. I had a lot of trouble finding engineering students that had the time to work with me, and realised in the last couple of months that I'd have to do it myself. That being said, this was honestly a blessing in disguise. I would have been content to give a kind of a rough guide as to what I wanted to whoever I ended up finally working with, but I'd have mostly deferred to their assumed experience rather than said a lot. I thought mixing was a skill that was way too complicated for me to pick up during this year alongside everything else I was also doing. My lateness in starting this has meant that I've cut way closer to the deadlines than I'd like to, but I was able to make my songs as I wanted them to be made. Looking at music as a producer has definitely made me a better musician as well. It's similar to when I started looking at the music I wrote as a composer rather than as just a bassist. I feel like I have a deeper understanding of what makes a good piece of music. I may have had a stressful struggle to pick up 3 years worth of engineering skills in 2 months, but honestly, I wouldn't have had it any other way. I set out this year to be self-sufficient, and I have made great steps towards that goal. Most of the collaborative work I've done with musicians this year would have to be my work with Drive Through Hazy, a trip-hop act with my friends Joe and Bridget. I recorded some bass for them on their song In the Night. And also for Spread Lies About Me. Both were very useful in developing experience as a session musician. It's really helpful to work with people who have a clear idea of what they want, because it's always close to what you think, but it's never exactly the same. Recording bass for In the Night, I originally sent them 2 recordings. One of me playing the changes as simply as possible, and one where I played a lot. I found out from their feedback that what they wanted was closer to the former, and we spent some time together discussing it and their song Appetizing. I wouldn't play bass on this song, on the record, but I'd learn it anyway to join the group as a session bassist for gigs like the NTU live streams. These sessions recording bass and playing for the band's live shows went exceptionally well, I think. I contributed small things to the songs creatively, and I thoroughly enjoyed the experience of playing with the band live. Ever since we did the first session writing what would eventually become Trap Street, Ellie and I have spent a lot of Friday sessions writing and recording both my songs and hers. For her songs, she gave me chords and almost complete freedom in what I would play underneath. I do think I did a good job, but I found the experience a lot harder than playing bass for Joe and Bridget. Ellie didn't really have much of an opinion, I think because she didn't feel like an authority on the subject. But deferring to my experience as a kind of a rock bassist when I'm playing bass for indie folk meant that I had to do a lot of listening to the kind of reference tracks that she provided me, rather than relying on my own experience. I did my best to play inoffensive bass lines that would highlight the chords she used in her songs, and added like small synthesizers to the melodies of her song In the Valley. Trap Street is a very different beast to the rest of the stuff I've done this year, and I can attribute that to my writing an acoustic guitar part to include Ellie. I'm not a very experienced guitar player, so when I wrote this song, I knew I had to play to my strength. I didn't know many chords on the guitar, so I wanted to try and build a song that used open chords effectively, rather than try and write complex guitar parts with chords I can't name and don't really completely understand. By having a swung bass line underneath that consisted almost entirely of chord tones, I was able to reinforce some simple strumming into what I think is a solid acoustic track, especially for someone who's not an acoustic artist. It was a unique arranging challenge for me, because I'd had the most luck up to this point arranging for other instruments like piano and strings. And when fitting multiple guitar tracks in the mix, I sort of had to play it by ear, feel it as I go. Last but certainly not least, I worked with Bobby to get drums and percussion in for my songs. This was essential to elevating the sound of the songs. I sent him recordings of what I've been working on with the simple MIDI drums that I've been programming myself, and I told him that this is vaguely what I wanted, but I lacked the experience to write drums that would elevate it to another level. I pointed out sections where I wanted things to be faster, wanted things to be slower, wanted to use specific drums here, but not sure what pattern I wanted to use, that kind of thing. And we spent Friday sessions in practice rooms where he would play me his interpretation of what I wanted, and I'd inevitably come up with a few notes every time. He was a delight to work with because he was very good at capturing the gist of what I was going for, even when the MIDI drums I provided definitely missed the mark by 1.5 miles. We had multiple recording sessions where we ended up recording drums for 2 of my songs at a time, resulting in complete drum tracks for everything that was on the initial Deep Blue EP, plus drums for the intro track I decided to bring in later on. He was even able to help me at the very end of the year with Trap Street and Gone by Morning. While it was too late in the year to get some real drums recorded for these, I found his feedback for the latter to be very helpful in consolidating the groove. For the former, I even got him to record some simple MIDI drums, because swung rhythms like Trap Street made the initial process of adding drums way harder than it needed to be for someone like me who doesn't play.